our first planned spend. And so you take a look at the target that we're going after, our first planned spend, which is resource spend, and you end up with the revenue streams. Lo and behold, the revenue streams happen to track what are the spend streams that we've been talking about. T&E, users, resource production, bolt-ons, and other. You do not make money running a lab. Okay, I would say that again. You do not make money running a lab. You can't close a business case. Labs are subsidized. They're either subsidized by the government, they're subsidized by the company. In other words, the profit lines of business, like Bell Labs, are paid for by Lucent. They get IP, and IP has value, but they don't make products. What you expect then is, how do you close your business case on user fees? You don't. User fees do not make this a profitable venture. It would require it to be subsidized. So how does the company make money? Makes money this way: revenue stream distribution. 20% in testing, 33% in resource production, and 39% on what we call bolt-ons. You go back and look, okay, well, let's see. Resource production. We're a city. We produce water. We produce power. We produce telecommunications. We produce these three things. 15 megawatt core facility. Remember, inside the fence, self-sustaining, going to throw trials at it, may break it. I can't sell that out to the public because it's not reliable. 85 megawatts of alternative power, it's called bolt-ons. Those bolt-ons are bolted onto our existing infrastructure, but they're outside the fence. So if I got a geothermal facility, I can sell most of that while that geothermal facility is getting test data on running in the city. I can take down my core power plant and sell that fossil off. Or while the core power plant is operating, the geothermal is basically available, I can sell geothermal out. I can do the same with wind, I can do the same with solar. So I come up with a product mix based on where I am. That gives me the ability to sell roughly 80, 85, maybe a little bit more power out onto the grid. Some of this power generation I don't pay for. You do. The taxpayer does. You pay for it because it's in the form of a grant. Because Sandia or Los Alamos wants to run a large-scale solar field on a next-generation solar system, and they want to do it at scale instead of just small, and so we offer them a place to bolt on. We're not an applicant for grants. We won't apply for grants. We're a venue for grant holders. So we'll come down and they'll bolt it onto our system, run it on the city for 5 years, the life of the grant, and then when the grant expires, they have two choices. One is they can tear it down, which is more on small-scale stuff is what they do. Number two is they can transfer it over to us, and we'll buy it from them on a discounted basis. So I now have a productive asset with no CapEx. I do have an increased operational expense, but now I've got a channel to sell it out for its useful life. Same with water, same with the data center. So when you get to resource production is roughly 33% of our overall revenue stream. Bolt-ons, which means grants that generate those three resources that are bolted onto our infrastructure, that's another 39%. So how does it all work in tandem with each other? 8%, 20% testing, 33% resource, and 39% bolt-ons. The bolt-ons, remember, we don't pay for the bolt-ons. The bolt-ons are coming from grants, but they're generating roughly 40% of my resource production. We do CapEx and pay for the resource production. And of course, the user fees we're trying to keep low. We're trying to keep them down at 20%. And when you really look at it overall, there's your growth pattern. If you're looking at these colors here, remember blue is resource production, and make sure my colors are right. Yeah, and pink or magenta was bolt-on. So we start with our original infrastructure, which would be a fossil facility, a water facility, a telecommunications facility. That would make us revenue ready. These dates are somewhat changed. They're actually back here a little bit. When you add a bolt-on, you increase more capacity, which increases more of your resource production. You start injecting what would be test data. The user activity gets larger, but relative to the overall cost growth, your user this user revenue here still stays in proportion to roughly around 20%. So as you go out at roughly around 159 million, out 15, 20 years, that's a projected based on resource bolt-on and $60 million a year of bolt-ons over a 10-year period. So a $400 million facility, which would be a $1 billion facility in 10 years, of which 600 million would be bolt-ons, but also would be resource available to add to our resource production. You get basically to a model where you can finance this in a couple of stages. The first stage you finance it is right here. You finance it on your utility infrastructure. You go out to the marketplace and you present a lead bank, for example, that is interested in investing in municipal power, municipal water, telecommunications, and you do what has been done for decades, and that is you'd have a power purchase agreement or a water purchase agreement or a take-or-pay contract from a credit-worthy buyer, and they discount that by 50%. They put it all together, they come up with a number, and that's the number they loan you over a 20-year period, and that's how you build your infrastructure. You build it basically with leveraged project finance off of your productive capacity. Their risk, if you build it and it operates and it's under contract, they could care less if you're a test facility. Because their downside security is they have a productive water plant, power plant, and telecommunications infrastructure that's going to operate whether or not you build your city or not. The next thing you do is you build your city, and when you build the city with a bond, and not a public bond, but a private bond, like a high-yield bond. In this case, it'd be about a $250 million bond, and the way to build the city is to pre-subscribe it. Not the users, but the field labs. We already have one negotiation right now on securing a field lab. If I pre-subscribe 2 field labs, I have enough economic basis to basically issue the bond for the city lab. And then after that, you're essentially a cash business that essentially is cash positive somewhere in this area right here, about 2017. And back to the original site. So you take all the pieces together. This facility, the labs generate themselves 20% of the revenue. If you take the infrastructure, the bolt-ons and the resource production, and then what we call other being advanced manufacturing locations for expansion, the research lab itself, rents, tenants, users, residents, all that. That's 80% of your business case. And there's about 20 million to 30 million in private equity that would be deployed on the front end of this for land acquisition, regulatory, all the things necessary to get it to bankers, to get it, lawyers, and get it primed. The rest would be leverage finance, and then somewhere down the road, you'd look for a strategic exit, and that exit would be someone who's in this business, whether you pick a Carlyle or you pick a Blackstone or a KKR, who wants this facility not for what it generates, but for what it does and who uses it, and the market position that a private equity and innovation fund would find interesting. And then that's when Pegasus itself would exit the scene, and there would be someone else who'd come over and take over. We will never be the operations manager of this. We'll sub that out to another company, but we'll retain the ownership of it until such time that a strategic comes in and buys us out. So I have done that a little over, but I have now 40 minutes roughly for Q&A, and ask me anything except where we're going to put it. Thank you.
Is there anyone that has a question for Bob?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was very interested in your story about China, Korea, U.S. technology. And, you know, recently there has been some problems with that. Is that something that gets to a higher national security issue when you do something like that?
Well, we all operate under what are referred to as the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, which is a regime, if you will, that comes out of both the Export Administration Regulations, and essentially it's dealing, most often it just deals with transfer of technical data. Know-how, there's is as benign as a federal lab official publishing a paper on a new composite material process he might have. If it has been, federal dollars has been used for that paper, or if it has some national security requirements in it, then it'd be restricted and they'd have to get a license to be able to publish it publicly. The activity that we're involved in will have we hope, and we're going to ask for it, is to have a local ITAR office from state and the State Department there, so that you can do one-stop shopping on ITAR. If you need a DSP-85, which is the technical term for transfer of technical data, you should be able to get it there, or else find out why you can't have it. That deals with transfer of information that is U.S. citizen, U.S. government produced. But now why we wouldn't have that problem if the Chinese, for example, or the Singaporeans, or even the British, build their own field lab. They build their own field lab, that's little England. And as long as they're not bringing in U.S. technical data and they're just running their own data development, then arguably they don't have a reason to have a license. There's no, the real trick here is run a TAA program, which is a tech transfer program that allows you to do the things you want to do without contaminating it with what would be that piece of information that puts it into a category that requires a license. I would expect that those two examples I gave you are the extremes. The normal is this is designed as a place for people to meet and work together. So consequently, if American companies get here, commercial companies get here and work on things, and Japanese companies work on it, and Brazilian companies work on it, there's always going to be an overlay of, do we have an ITAR issue here? If we do, how do we manage it? And let's get it properly papered. But there's a whole lot of robust commercial communications that goes on without any ITAR restrictions. The last is patenting, copyright and trademarking. The idea of being able to file your patents and get them filed with the appropriate disclosures and that sort of thing. Most of our foreign competitors really watch the patent system, the filing system, to look for a competitive edge. A lot of that's publicly available information, which has already been deemed non-ITAR, restricted. But yeah, you're going to be around a facility here, and with this works, you'll be around a facility where you're going to have, I hope, multicultural and multinational people. I'll give you a better example of that. King Abdullah Smart City program. He's built 5 smart cities. They're all sector specific. Remember I said earlier it's not Disneyland and energy land and this land and that land? He built 5 different lands. He built a maritime land, he built a city land, he built a women's college. Those were all driven by interesting aspects of his national and popular growth. He enabled a chair at MIT for a noted professor in smart technologies and paid that chair to have him sit make 6 visits to his cities as the chair of that program at King Abdullah University. At the same time, he had a reciprocal chair at MIT. Now, that chair was intended so that the grad students coming from Saudi would have an anchor for their training as grad students, that professor. So they gave him money that their grad students could cluster around, so that when they finished their grad term, they went back to the university in Saudi under the same chair, same guy, and would begin what in medical school would call their residency. They're interested in this because this gives some place for their graduate students to go before they come back. So we endow a chair at MIT, and that chair at MIT is to have a presence here at this facility at our lab, at our field lab. So that means those grad students are going to be here living in your community, working at the facility with office space in the campus, and pulling a year or 2 years for their post-grad work, so they then can go back to Saudi, if you will, into the business community, having worked on infrastructure that, number one, is the same infrastructure they have at home, but under the guidance and tutelage of this particular professor. Number two is next door and with access to American infrastructure to participate in its development as well. So in a sense, I'll give the Saudis a lot of credit. They see how they get a double bang out of this. That, by the way, is not an isolated story. The Singaporeans endow chairs with the universities. The Chinese do the same thing. And what you're seeing is a lot of grad students who are here in the United States are really foreign grad students who are spending their time here under those kinds of arrangements to go back to their own countries and begin the process of advanced development there on technology that we haven't deployed in our own country yet. So, yes. Yes, sir.
You touched briefly on it. You talked about putting a security fence around your city.
Mm-hmm.
You also talked a little bit about different countries coming in and siting in your field labs. I'm curious what your thought has been regarding security specifically.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things with national labs, certainly Sandia,
Sure.
Los Alamos and so on. I mean, they have their secured areas. A lot of universities here in New Mexico State, there's Physical Science Lab is a secured facility. And that's one aspect, that's defense or national security issues. The other is just commercial security. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to be bringing in presumably companies that would be looking to compete either within the nations or with each other, and yet you got a mixed campus and you've got a lot of opportunity. I'm sure you have non-disclosure for your company and what have you, but I can foresee some issues that would arise from just those questions that revolve around basically keeping trade secrets, keeping commercial
Copyright.
Copyright. The
Yep,
whole
confidential.
What are you guys looking at in that?
We have a sub-project that we are about to kick off with another, what I would call major vendor. SAIC has been working with us on the underlying, as well as Perkins & Will. This is Perkins & Will, the architectural firm's work that I've just gone through. SAIC has been looking at it from a standpoint of the customer requirement and the demand and the power plants and that sort of thing, the real granular stuff. We have another vendor that once we pick the site, we'll have an announcement. We'll also announce them at the same time. And their entire focus for the next 3 years is ConOps, concept of operations, and that's what you're talking about. One of the key drivers in ConOps is, of course, security, but then there's also preserving the data, not only preserving it so that whoever paid for it gets it in the form that they wanted it, so it makes it usable, but also so that no one else sees it. We have had extensive discussions with a number of different folks that if you work from the harder point back, I file an application to participate or to do an experiment here. What happens? You go to a peer review board, they look at what you want to do, they check off on ethics and public safety, then the next thing you go through is concept of operations. How can we do it to meet their methodology requirement, but at the same time preserve their data? I put down under the backbone a lot of fiber optics and a lot of secure comms. We're going to have a black conduit, a white conduit, and a gray conduit. The black conduit would be for Tier 4 classified type activity. The gray conduit would be for civil science and research. The white conduit would be for commercial. The concept right now is that we would have an end-to-end encrypted secure link from the point of origin to the point of test, back to the point of origin. And again, we've run it through a practical way of doing that. You're a associate degree holder from either here or another school, and you're competent in IT and you're competent in programming. You've got a job essentially to run tests that day on 2 houses relative, or maybe even a subdivision of 25 as to what they want to have done. You have a test list of what you've got to go through. On your screen is an icon for each house. You bring the icon up on your screen. You essentially manage what is already pre-programmed plug-and-play outlets in there for monitors, sensors, cameras, whatever is necessary to pull the data in and out. You make sure they're all functioning operationally. You run the experimentation. The experiment really drops into what would be its own folder, its own data folder. That data folder then is encrypted, and then you send it back out to what would be the next level up for review. That review is done, and then it's sent out to the customer. So if you can represent end-to-end that is going from the point of test to the point of delivery, Now that point of delivery can be at several stops along the way. It can be at the research campus and it just terminates there. That means we're end to end. We control it. We control the conduit, we control the fiber, and we control the pop. And it hasn't distributed itself out on the grid at all. If you get and you want it distributed from the research facility, the campus, out onto the grid, then we have to have, and we're starting to have conversations now with the carriers to make sure that we get an encryption level transfer out of their carrier or hotel onto their carrier under their service level agreements that get to that, that individual on the other end. I can only talk about this one because I'm a telecom guy. So moving data, encrypted data, and how you manage data is something I'm comfortable with. But the overall point is we're going to have to have a concept of operation that is not only dealing with interior security, compartmentalized security, badge-related SCANA, access security, but also commercial security, as well as data security. And those will all be worked on before that lab opens up. There'll be a ConOps document that'll really be run through the focus groups of the labs. They have to be comfortable with it. The security agencies, they have to be comfortable with it. But primarily the CTOs and the IP guys in the commercial companies, they have to be comfortable with it. So just like this presentation, we've been on the road since April on this, and the feedback we've gotten from people we've talked to on focus groups has been invaluable in terms of how adjustments we need to make. We'll do the same with ConOps. Yes, sir.
Bob, who are some of your competitors, and what are you doing to build barriers to entry by others?
Well, the last would be an antitrust violation. So I'm not in the business of building barriers, but I am in the business of taking advantage of our competitive advantage, our first mover opportunity. My biggest competitors, quite candidly, is the federal labs, and I don't view them as a competitor. They view us as potentially as a competitor because they're a budget-driven, animal, and their view would be is if somehow I'm attacking that $62 billion, I'm getting money that they don't get. We've had a number of focus groups with the labs, and they're coming around now to the understanding that we can do two things for them. One is help them expand what would be their research funding, because now they have, another place to go to spend. Sandia is pretty much restricted now on what it can do outside the fence. So, and its real estate inside the fence is pretty tight now. So this gives them the ability to treat us as an annex to Sandia and factor that into their budget process. So I'm not taking their money. What I'm doing is giving them a good justification on either grant writing or budget writing or staffing that would extend their reach and therefore the use of their personnel into a wider, deeper form. So I think to an informed lab, they've come around. There are, some of you may not know this. I've got a government background myself. I was a former general counsel of the Department of Commerce, a Reagan appointee, and I was there in the 80s when we were implementing Bayh-Dole, and we were doing some things about changing the law on cooperative research. So this kind of is an area of a wheelhouse that I'm familiar with. The other issue we have with the labs is they talk a different language than the private sector. To them, proprietary information, as mentioned earlier, is one thing, one animal. To the private sector, it's something entirely different. I'm having that experience right now on another project where I've got a whole lot of IP, federally funded IP. I need investors to come in and look at it. And the guy who developed it, the lab that developed it, won't talk to them because of ITAR. And even though they're Americans, I have to go through a TAA process to have investors to be able to sit down and hear a technical description of the thing they're about to invest in. So it takes time. And if you've got the staying power, you're successful. If you don't, you fail. So it's this stretch out. So in the second area, I have to learn, I know that I can't teach the labs new language. So instead, we're adopting the language and procedures that the labs have, and we're going to create a 501c3 that will in fact be our federal channel, conduit. So it will go out and talk to the labs. We'll staff it with former lab people so they all talk the same language. It'll have the same kind of legal regime that the labs would, but then Los Alamos can talk to this entity, and then would be able as a 501c3 have no profit motive, but be able to then talk to us. And by creating that 501c3 that's a lab channel or an FFRDC channel, we'd also create one for the academic community, so that the academic community, which talks another language that the labs don't speak and the private sector doesn't speak, you put that in, and then you've got two 501c3s that really translate back to us, then allow us to basically bring the private sector in that way. So I think, kind of in summary, if they see that it is enhancing their budget, we're not a competitor. If we go off and apply for competitive grants with them, we're stupid enough to do that, then we would be. We're not going to do that. We want to be a venue. We want to be, we're sort of the classic destination wedding here. We want them to come here to our place. We don't want to compete with them. And so in a sense, we just have to get the word out that we're not going to compete with them and help them lobby for grants if necessary in DC. The second would be is to give them the comfort level that their general counsel can talk to our GC inside the 501c3, and they're saying the same thing because our GC happens to have come out of a federal lab. One last point. One of the labs mentioned to us they have a brain drain problem. You look at the average age of the labs, it's getting up there. It's getting close to my age now. So how do they attract smart, young, competent guys and ladies who are all going to come in there and work? Men and women who are coming right out of the universities who want to work there and stay for 30 years. It's not happening. You come in like an internship and a residency, you pull 3 to 5 years in a lab and you find a sector of research. You stay in that sector of research until you see a business case that really makes some sense, and then you're going to Palo Alto, or you're going to Boston, or you're going down to the Raleigh Research Triangle, because you're not going to stay in the lab, unless you're just pure research oriented. So the labs are starting to say, you guys could be, it's a given, we're going to have a brain drain, but I can forestall the brain drain by essentially these long-term projects, like 5 years on a next-generation solar facility attached to your facility. If I get a team that actually ties themselves to that project, then I got them for 5 more years. And they're really transitioning out, but they're transitioning out on a project they're excited about and they want to stay with. And that creates the ability for me to reload. Now I'm changing the character of the labs from being sort of, an old guy, old sort of closed shop environment. It's a much more dynamic environment where you're really taking out of the universities, running them through a program, getting them attached once they're trained into something that's unique and special, getting them grants, supporting them, getting them out to basically do something real world, scale their research, and then if they stay with the labs and do another one, great. If they go, then I've gotten 5, maybe 10 years worth of value out of them, but I got more of them coming behind it. I think that's very creative on the labs part. Yes, ma'am.
Once you choose location, you have a very interesting model for financing. How do you foresee getting a critical mass of investors and revenue streams that would enable you to launch?
Well, since May, the project finance that I'd mentioned, we've got that. We have that. The ability to take the $100+ million project finance commitment letter, because it becomes a driver of the private equity. So in other words, if I go to you and you're a private equity investor interested in this, your first question is I'm the first money in? That's a bad position for me to be in. The answer is no, you're not. I've got 2.5 years of financing already in place. There's a revenue stream associated with this. You are first money in, but on this commitment. So at a simultaneous close, I'm looking at your 20 million coming in with the bank's 120, or the bank's 100. The flip side is the bank says, I'll give you 100 as long as you bring in 20. So the two are mutually, no one wants to be first. I mean, Pegasus is in this for already, our own money, but no one wants to be first. But in my experience, being simultaneous with 2 different kinds of investors with the same sort of mutually supporting investment, that has a tendency to work. No, if you break it down, publicly available information is $250 for which would be the 3x5 footprint, and then $150, which would be about 100 to would be the core, power plants, and that's not all the bolt-ons. That's the core power plants, water plant, communications facility, carrier hotel, research facility. think the research facility, for example, is about 28 million, something like that. So, as well as you know, teaming up, staffing up, lawyers, always lawyers, and the banker fees, et cetera. So, our financial model looks at 20 million, and then the leverage financed for the core build to get us revenue ready. And then when you get to evaluation for the bond, you get the benefit of the value of the facilities that you have built, the value of your take-or-pay contracts, the financing you have in place, asset plus liabilities, and then essentially the land that you've procured, and then the sort of debate you're going to have on the value of the intellectual property. And then if you pre-subscribe 2 of the field labs, which may run somewhere around 50 million apiece, then on long-term leasing, then you add all that up, you get to evaluation, and then you go out and do a bond raise. Now the bond raise will be secured by that productive asset, and then you go out and do a large capital raise.
So that 5-year ramp up to full financing can't start until you get the simultaneous close, right?
That's right, and I can't do the simultaneous close until I settle on the location. The location is the key here, and I know there's been a lot of press about you know, where are we going to go. I mean, there's a big economic impact here no matter where we put it. And the idea of being in one community or another community, I can say with certainty that every community we've gone to has been welcoming, supportive, excited about it. They want it. It's the details of what a monster like this will be, not in terms of changing their economic climate, but in the impact it's going to have. It can't be too close to an airport. I mean, this is generating all sorts of science activity, but there's a lot of above ground RF activity that's going to go out here. So you can't run the, you know, for public safety reasons, I can't allow the activity to get outside the fence. So this has to be remote, and yet at the same time it has to be close enough in so people are comfortable about, you know, going to work and then going home, because we're not going to build houses out here. So in a sense, it has to be close enough on a commuting basis. The state did a PRO, which is this partnership review opportunity, project review opportunity. The Board of Advisors did that for us. And that surveyed all the communities in the state, sent out a notice in February and said, anyone who wants it, come back and tell us you want it, and we'll add you to the list. Well, 16 communities came back and said, we want it. Harding County said I could have the whole county. All 894 residents of Harding County said, you know, all you got to do is pay to relocate us, and you can have the entire county. So, bless their heart. We went through, we didn't go through the list. We're not from here. So we relied on the Board of Advisors, who created a working group with representatives from each area of the state. John Hummer, real estate agent here, John was one of the representatives. We had Jim Manette out of Roswell to represent sort of the Permian Basin area. We had folks out of Albuquerque. The only negative we got was a voicemail from Val Kilmer in Santa Fe telling us, don't build it in Santa Fe. So we relied on the advisors. They reviewed the list. They came back, gave us 3. Hobbs, Las Cruces, Corralitos there, and Albuquerque. We looked at the 3, and then we applied what I've gone through in detail with the location. And you get into this, and I've said this publicly, state land, uncertain process, private land, you can buy it, it's a capital asset. That's one option. Number 2 is existing infrastructure, very little infrastructure. So if you really compared the two, you've got an uncertain process in terms of acquisition of land and a spend for infrastructure that doesn't exist. Or you go where there is infrastructure and you pay more for the land, but you've got the land. And then the two, either way, it's about, you know, it's the same number either way. Less cost for land, more for infrastructure, more for land, very little for infrastructure. So we went to Hobbs, and it was a fabulous community. I mean, it's great. The mayor, Mayor Cobb, the Commissioner Fulfer, Lisa Hardison, who runs economic development, and Mike Gallagher. That community did everything they possibly could do at our request to help us locate it there. And it didn't work. Couldn't do it. And the best analogy I can give you without going into details is, I don't know how many of you bought houses in your lives, but you know, you go to the first house, you see it, and you say, I don't want to buy the first house, and I'll go to the next house. You go 3, 4 more houses, then you go back and find out someone bought the first house, and you've lost it. Or else worse, you focus on the first house and find out you can't close. Well, and I've said this publicly, I'll say it again, that was my fault. We got caught up in the excitement, and we went down there, and we assumed that all the other issues, which I'm going through now, impact, et cetera, would just fall away, and boom, we'd plug and play, and we'd be off and running. It's my fault. And when we left that community, it's because we couldn't get a deal done. And so what we've done since the last 3 months is, with the support of my vendors, is do it the opposite way. We have been not so quietly wandering around the state, seeing the other locations, and looking at, again, Corralitos and others to see, have we missed anything? We've thrown open the door to any private ranchers, public lands, tribal lands, you name it, to see, we don't want to make another decision and then find ourselves in a position that we missed the first house, or we should have bought the second house. So this process is coming quickly to an end. And some of the things that we had expected we would deal with, because you always deal with regulatory both before you buy and then after you buy, we're dealing with now. So we're trying to knock down FCC, knock down FAA, knock down some of the other regulatory environmental issues so that we can quantify the risk. And then what you'll hear when we announce again is not that we're going to X, Shangri-La, as I call it. We've closed a deal. And so instead of announcing where we're going to close a deal, we're going to close a deal and announce it's closed. And that should be pretty soon.
So your first deal was a land deal?
Well, they're all land deals. They're all land deals. I mean, there's a land deal here. This is state land, and as you all know, I have to go through a 6-month state land process and a bid process. And candidly, the bid process is uncertain because I may not know who may show up and want to buy 20 square miles out in Corralitos. Compare that to being able to buy it straight out and pay more for it, but own it. It's much smarter, if everything else works, is to buy the land.
Bob, thank you for coming this morning and talking about all this. My question has to do with your revenue stream, and in particular the resource production.
Sure.
And more precise is the water.
Right.
As you know, water in New Mexico is very important to us. And secondly, it is controlled by the state.
State engineer.
Yes. Have you begun or in the process of securing water rights for this project?
Till we know the location for sure, that would be one of the things we would knock down before we actually bought it. There's 2 aspects. There's a regulatory aspect to water, and then there's the business aspect to water. I'll give you a good example, and it's the Permian Basin example, for example. Water out of that aquifer is $25 a barrel. So there's not a water cleaning business there. Remember, we're a T&E facility, so we're not in the water cleaning business. We're in the test and evaluation business of cleaning water. Then my question is, what do I do with the excess water? It's a waste of a resource to pour it out. It's a waste of a resource to pump it back into the aquifer. So we would take it and basically sell it out in the community. If water is $25 a barrel, then, there's very little water opportunity here, you're blessed with having a lot of water. I've been told in El Paso and in this area, we have a lot of water. We just don't have it at the price we want. And so that's kind of a regional theme. Our interest was based on what would be a generic New Mexico water strategy, which is first and foremost, we're going to pull water up or buy it from the community to run our facility. We have to have a self-sustaining facility, so I have to keep our water separate from your water. I can't afford to have a backflow if we're doing certain types of testing that relate to wastewater treatment and gets back into your water supply. So it has to go to a point where yours is cut off and ours starts, and we have our own water supply. That's 130, to keep all the pipes wet, that's about 130 gallons a day of water circulation. It's not a big water facility. How would we get that? We'd either bring it up, if we have water rights, and we get them for both the landowner and the state engineer, or we would go deeper into the saltwater aquifer and bring it up, water and brackish, and combine 2 things. Cleaning the water which is a T&E function, and using the water for our own purposes, and then defining how far we want to go into gray water or potable water to resell it out. All right, then the third strategy was the Permian Basin strategy, which is cleaning fracked water. Now, we got really excited about that because that's now the volume of 25 cents a barrel turns in our favor. It's 25 cents a barrel of 450 million barrels of water that are sucked out of the aquifer in the Permian Basin for fracking. Huge amount of water. And it's going to have ultimately an impact on what would be the aquifer size. As it goes out, it's lost. It's a lost resource because once it's in the fracking process, it's contaminated. And what you do with it is you turn around and inject it back into the saltwater aquifer to just get rid of it. So you got 450 million barrels of your fresh water at 25 cents a barrel. That's a lost resource that's not being recovered. But the real economics is it's $4.50 that the frackers will pay you to take that dirty water and inject it. That's an EPA risk that the state engineer knows full well that ultimately there's got to be an evaluation as to who owns that water at some point after it's been contaminated. So if you look at $4.50 a barrel and not 25 cents a barrel, and you go, well, if I can clean this resource, number one, and I can clean it competitively, and they're paying me to take their water. So if I take their water and I clean it and I give it back to them and sell it back to them, it's 25 cents a barrel if that's what they want to buy it for. And then the logic happens that the EPA and the state engineer come in and say, you know what? You're not going to take out any more fresh water. You're going to have to recycle, in a green sense, that fracked water into a usable resource and continue to just recycle that. All of a sudden now, you're looking at 50 million barrel facility making somewhere around $75 to $100 million a year, and not almost all of that, but a significant amount of that is margin. So just as a business guy, I'm thinking, well, you know, okay, those numbers are not on that chart because water is not part of our financial strategy. We didn't put it in. If you put that in there, you're looking at a lot bigger bump on resource production and bolt-on. So my point is, relative to a water strategy, we have talked indirectly to the state engineer's office as well as the state land office on minerals, et cetera, but until I pick a location, there's not a fracked water cleaning process, I don't think, in Corralitos or in the other areas outside the basin because of transportation issues. But if I could crack that nut, there's enough margin with UTEP and in New Mexico State participating. We could do the same thing here that we might have been able to do in Hobbs or in Clovis or in some of the other cities.
Okay. Then one last question. At some point during this whole project, if it fails, what will happen to the land?
Well, it depends on what's on the land. I mean, to a certain degree, I had somebody tell me the other day that, gee, you get to a point where you've built a city, gee, I mean, some of us might want to move in there and leave where we are. Being a little bit glib here, but it depends on where your point of failure is. If your failure is at you're a private business, so you have risk of failure. Risk is throughout. So on the front end, our risk now is Pegasus and our money that's invested in it. So there is no land risk. It's all our private risk. The day we raise private equity and we raise what would be the leveraged finance, we'll have picked a location. That then essentially you've got a physical space. The leveraged financing is, as I mentioned earlier, is already comfortable. They could care less if I ever build build a T&E because they'll just be in the power business, the water business, and the telecommunications business. Because that first infrastructure will look like a utility district. It won't look like the city. It's when you build the city. To do the city, you're going to have to de-risk that model. Meaning, in other words, you're going to have to find users and uptakes that will want to use that facility. So at various stages of what you would call risk-taking, the first risk is Pegasus as the developer. The second risk would be the investors in the utility district. They're comfortable with that. The land that's purchased, there's a productive resource sitting on it. There may be a lot of land, and it may be only take it up, about one third of it, but there's still productive resource there, which you could sell off the land if you wanted to. There hadn't been any development on it. And then third, when you go to the actual bond and you build the whole thing out, then the question would be is, at that point, yeah, now you're operating, your utilities are in place, you've pre-subscribed your user community. If over that 5-year period, you haven't hit your markers on these, then you're staging your build so that you can abandon the project at any one of those stages and just call it a day. I had one person tell me that we would get to the point of putting the bond out and we would build it, and the federal government would come in and they would declare it an essential facility, and then they would buy it from us. That is strategically not in our interest, and we've told them that. But we've also been told in DC that if this actually works, it becomes such a critical facility that it shouldn't be in private hands. That's an interesting discussion at the Hay Adams over a drink as to why not, because there's too much economic power concentrated in this, because they're basically saying you guys can't be trusted in running this facility because you're controlling all this data and all this information on behalf of all these people. Our answer back is, no, we're not. We're managing it, but that's a nice problem to have, and put it that way. That's called a rich man's problem. And if they want to come in and buy it, we'll sell it to anybody we could sell it to, because I mentioned earlier, we're in the development business. We are not going to be if we're really good at this, we're gone in 2 years. If we're not really good at this, we're gone in 2 years. So, sorry.
We're going to do a 2-minute drill here.
Okay.
I was kind of struggling to figure out the comps here because there are no comps here in the U.S. And what I'm thinking is Chinese new districts. I've been to probably a dozen districts over there where they go from dust to gleam, Shangri-La, if you will, in a year.
Right.
And they don't have the environmental impact issues and siting issues that we have. Having spent 16 years living in Silicon Valley and thinking about how do we go, you either succeed or fail in 2 years. What's the biggest impediment to quick success for you, or proper success? Where is that latency? Is it that 6-month EI siting environmental impact that you mentioned?
No. The thing that we're spending the most time that we've identified as our biggest risk is our ability to resell our resource. If we're in a community that's perfect and we can't resell the resource, remember, that's 80% of, then I have to fall back on the lab carrying the load. And I'm comfortable to stand up here and tell everybody no one makes money on a lab. You've got to make money somehow else. You've got to subsidize the lab somehow. Chinese government subsidizes theirs, we subsidize ours, even Silicon Valley subsidizes their internal ones. So how do you do that? We've come up with, I think, and New York thinks is a creative way of doing it. But I may find myself going to a location that is less attractive as a T&E location, but more attractive for a resource resale location, because that's my sole risk. My ability to build that resource production facility, to get it up and running and revenue ready, which stimulates what would be that PE investment, that's it. We do that. The word in our business is what point do you become real? We become real when you not just break ground, but you become revenue ready. Once you're revenue ready, I can accelerate the lab build, but I have stretched it out, as you've seen on that chart, for New York, so they don't think I'm out here spending money on non-productive resources. I have to separately fund the lab, which means I've got to create a subsidization base for it, and then, boom, put the lab on top of it. So the biggest risk I have is picking the wrong place that doesn't synergize the resource production. Picking the right place that justifies resource production might actually be the wrong place for the lab. And believe me, that's the nub of it. That really is the nub of it. And life's not perfect. I'll have to do, we have to do some trade-offs in here, but that's really where we are. And when we finally make the decision, it'll be because I've struck a proper risk balance between the resource production base and our ability to finance that utility structure, and at the same time, a location which makes good sense, and also from a standpoint of the user community they're comfortable with to basically operate it.
Thank you very much, Bob. We really appreciate you coming. We know you have a very busy schedule, so thanks once again.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just a little bit of housekeeping to do. Remember that we have our translators here. They're in the back of the room. So if you need a headset or an audiophone, that's back with Patricia, Rosa Maria, and Alejandra. Also, remember, we need to clear this room so that we need to vacate the room so that they can get in here, clean up, and prep for our keynote lunch speaker. So thank you very much.